So in the next chapter of Spengler's Decline of the West, this is chapter 5, it's called Macrocosmos, the symbolism of the world picture and the space problem. And so now, whereas in the previous chapter we had talked about the destiny idea and how it unfolds with a certain directionality through time, now we go back to the space problem to take a look at the world as nature picture, which is opposed to the world as history, the destiny idea, and back to the realm of space, and how space is configured differently. Spengler will want to know in each one of the cultures and why it's configured differently. So the world picture is then the world as nature, and he starts off this chapter by talking about how the basic idea of the macrocosm is the sum total of all symbols in relation to a single soul. Whether the soul is that of an individual or whether the soul is that of a civilization doesn't matter. The macrocosm always has reference to a single point of view, is the first point that he wants to make. And all the symbols that make up the image of the macrocosm are petrified. They are symbols of things that have become. They're essentially dead, but their purpose is to capture and bind the world fear and terror and anxiety that is activated in the human soul as the result of its apprehension of death. And so Spengler will then discuss in this chapter how there is an intimate interrelation between death and depth. That is to say, that behind each of the emergence of each one of these civilizations, different space conception, its different understanding of directionality, comes out of how there's a different apprehension of death in each case. He'll make the argument that death, in other words, is the apprehension of death, the human apprehension of death. It's the recognition of death for what it is, lies at the root of all human cultural activity. Human cultural activity springs up out of the fear and terror that comes along with this sudden recognition of death for what it is. This is perfectly crystallized in Arno Björklund's painting, the 19th century painting by him. He was a Swiss painter, Mary Magdalene lamenting the dead body of Christ, which shows him lying on a slab with a veil draped over him, and she is lamenting. And it's a perfect image of what Spengler is talking about here, the recognition that with the dead body, we have now a thing become, something that has become holy matter, holy space, something that is exclusively pure extension. It's no longer in time. When the soul is no longer in the body is no longer in time. It has become pure space. It has become. It's pure extension. And he says that oftentimes it'll be the case that with children, the awakening of the child's inner life tends to be associated with an early traumatic incident in which there will be the death of a relative, say, or the death of a pet, in which the child suddenly apprehends death as the mystery for what it is, and insofar as he apprehends this death and experiences the fear that's associated with it, he begins to experience himself as a lonely, single being thrust out into an alien, extended world that now fundamentally is a chasm between the child and the world. There's a world fear there now, and the world fear of death brings about this spatial feeling, this feeling of depth and directionality. So there's an intimate relation, Spengler argues in this chapter, between death and depth. The two are tied in very, very closely together, and from out of this comes the macrocosm, a world picture, and it's different for each one of the civilizations, as is everything else that he discusses. And so we find that invariably, with the crystallization and birth of the soul of each one of these civilizations, a new death cult invariably comes in at its inception. With the Egyptians, of course, we get the burial of the pharaohs, first in the mastabas, which are then stacked one atop the next to get the pyramid of the pharaoh Zoser in the 3rd dynasty of Egypt. The death cult begins there. In the case of the Magian civilization, the death cult begins with the Christian catacombs and the sarcophagi. In the case of Faustian civilization, the death cult comes in with the cathedrals and their crypts, and the cathedrals as spaces within which the daily death and resurrection of Christ is enacted on a daily basis. Or in the case of the classical civilization, when along about 1200 BC the burning of the dead comes in. Same thing at about the same time happens in Vedic India. And so in each case, and then of course in early China we get the great Chinese tombs of Anyang, the Shang Dynasty tombs, which are these large, elaborate tombs, cruciform tombs that are buried and dug out into the earth as portals down to the yellow springs of the underworld. And so in each case we have a different death cult, and it's invariable. In other words, a sudden intuition of death marks the birth of the culture because it creates world fear and world terror, a world anxiety that then needs to be neutralized by the creation of myth and cult, of religion. And so in each one of these cases, we begin to see liturgies and rituals coming in that have the intended effect of neutralizing the death fear. For example, in the case of the Magian civilization, that's the Christian Arabian civilization, the sacrament of baptism is instituted, in which the individual is immersed into the pool and comes up out again with the immortal spirit inside of him as the neutralization of the death fear. In the case of Western Faustian Europe, the rite of contrition, of confession, the sacrament of confession, is selected out, which readies the individual soul to receive the Christ within him that then makes him immortal, or that allows him to participate in immortality. That also neutralizes the death fear. In the case of Egypt, of course, we get the mummification and the cult of the dead, and specifically that ritual which is known as the opening of the mouth, within which the dead body, after it's mummified, is turned into what's called a sahu, and it is set forth erect, and then a priest touches its mouth with a ladle that is in the shape of the constellation Ursa Minor, the wolf constellation, and confers upon the dead body a mouth, which then gives him the ability to speak the magical souls in the afterlife, which will enable him to navigate his way successfully through the afterlife, and so on. In each case of these civilizations, a new cult springs into being that is designed to neutralize the death fear. And now then the civilization is up and running, and this is why at the birth of each one of these civilizations, each one begins with a fundamentally religious modality that is linked with the death cult, the death fear, and intuition that goes along with that, as in the case of the child who experiences the dead body and experiences the fear that it is now alone in the alien, hostile, extended world. What goes along with that now, in the case of the cultures, is an apprehension of space as a unique kind of directionality. And so, Spengler then designates these different space feelings which come out of these death cults in each one of the cases as a prime symbol, an Urphänomen. The Goethe's idea of the Urphänomen, the prime symbol. Remember that Goethe had said that all the phenomena of nature have different prime symbols. The plant has the prime symbol of the leaf. The leaf is the sort of Platonic idea, the prime symbol of which all the different aspects of the plant are a transformation. The prime symbol of color is the opposition of light and darkness, and so forth. Spengler will now say that each one of these civilizations then has a prime symbol which is its way of capturing the death fear and turning it into a macrocosmic spatial picture. And so in the case of the classical civilization, the macrocosmic world symbol is that of the body, the concrete, solid human body, the Apollonian body. In the case of Western European civilization, the prime symbol is infinite space, the expansion through infinity. It's the exact opposite of the classical clinging to the body in the near and the present. In between them is the Magian civilization, for which the prime symbol is the world as cavern. The world is in a gigantic cave. You see this manifested in the architecture, first with the Pantheon, the Byzantine Hagia Sophia, the mosque, and so forth. With the case of the Egyptians, this prime symbol Spengler designates as the way, with a capital W. It is a single, narrow pathway, a trajectory of the dead soul on its way through the afterlife towards the inevitable day of judgment. All the Egyptian temples are always lined up in rows of seriality, which have the intended effect of guiding the soul along through the afterlife. In the case of the Chinese civilization, the prime symbol is the Tao, and its spatial feeling is that of the Mandarin or sage that simply wanders around randomly through nature, carried along in a non-linear fashion by the Tao, which moves him about. In India, the spatial feeling, space, the Hindus called space Akasha, and by Akasha they meant ether, but ether as a living ether, a living substance that is capable of spontaneously giving rise to morphogenesis, in which forms just simply crystallize out of this living ether. And it's their primordial space feeling. But for Spengler, the prime symbol of the civilization is the world as a dream. If you look at all the eyes and the statues of classical Indian art, they're all closed. The Indian mind is closed to the world is transformed into a dream, and so there's a kind of interiorization of the cosmos, and this is especially evident in the shift from the Vedic rituals, which are generally outer-directed at first, to the Upanishads, when the Vedic rituals are interiorized into the depths of the psyche, and the entire cosmos is, as it were, sucked down into the psyche and then spat back out, transformed as a dream. And so this is also consistent with the Indian ahistoric mentality, its lack of interest in any sense of history or time or particularities of incident and so forth. And so these are the different prime symbols, of which each one of these cultures spends its life cycle actualizing and working out this basic prime symbol. Now the prime symbol becomes to use Heideggerian language, it's each culture's particular way of understanding being and what it means to be in that culture. So that all the phenomena of the culture, all the cultural activity of the particular society in question is a manifestation of this prime symbol. Infinite space is already evident there in the Gothic cathedrals with their upthrust, their expansion. And the primary aspect, the primary metaphysical aspect, is that of a force moving the mass. In the case of the classical civilization, the Doric temple does not soar, it simply hovers. It's simply purely present, and it just sits there and it hovers, self-contained in on itself, and the primary opposition is form and matter, not force and mass. In the Arabian, the sense of the dome, the world dome, is to contain the contention of the cosmic powers of light and darkness within a world stage within which the struggle is worked out. And the science that is developed out of this Arabian alchemy, the primary dichotomy becomes that of substance and attribute. And if you can change the substance magically, you can turn base metals into gold, perhaps, or do different things with matter and get them to transubstantiate and so forth. So each culture will later develop a different kind of science that emerges out of this prime symbol and which is consistent with its world feeling. And so this is, I would point out that there's a contrast here with Heidegger's sense that the works of art of a culture are workings out of being, and Spengler's prime symbol corresponds to Heidegger's idea of being. They're similar ideas, except that there's a fundamental difference in that for Heidegger, and especially in his essay on the origin of the work of art, the work of art is not only a manifestation of being, it founds being. It creates being as a truth event, and so that the individual work of art actually creates being. Being does not pre-exist the work of art any more than truths or truth pre-exists the work of art. The artist is not, as in the Platonic theory of matching, simply copying things as they are, which are at a twice removed from the forms, since the forms of the physical world are copies of the eidos, the Platonic forms, and then Plato disparages art because it's twice removed, because the works of art are copies or representations, matching of particular things in the banal world. Heidegger says, no. If in that paradigm, which supports the traditional correspondence theory of truth as the agreement of knowledge with its objects, what happens there is a matching theory, whereas his theory of aletheia had said that truth is an event, it's a making, it's an unconcealing. So that being does not pre-exist works of art, it's realized through them. It's actually created. Created through the individual work of art or the work of philosophy. Heraclitus, for example, creates the sense of being as logos. Plato creates the sense of being as eidos. These understandings of being do not pre-exist their creations. And for Heidegger, being evolves and changes, and it's not something that simply pre-exists and allows the work of art to simply manifest it, The work of art actually creates the model itself. It is its own model, the work of art or philosophy. Whereas for Spengler,